Half of that $3.4 million belongs to me. My sister Lindsay's voice echoed off the wooden walls of the probate court. From the gallery behind her, our mother Marilyn offered a small, practiced smile. I kept my hands pressed flat against the smooth, cold vinyl of my dark blue care binder. The courtroom smelled of lemon floor wax and old paper. Beside me, Elliot Crane leaned in, and his leather chair gave a sharp squeak. "The final section of the video includes your mother," Elliot whispered, his breath barely stirring the air. "Once it plays, it becomes part of the public record." I turned my head. Mom was still smiling, looking at me like I was a stubborn child about to be caught in a lie. I thought about the spare key to my condo still sitting on her keychain, and I gave Elliot one small nod. He rose to his feet. "Your Honor, my client recorded this 3 days before his death." The judge looked over his glasses and nodded, prompting Elliot to reach for his laptop. 10 months earlier, the war began with a phone call at 17 minutes past 6 in the morning. The blue glare of my digital clock pierced the dark of my bedroom. I reached for my phone, feeling the freezing metal edge against my palm. I could already smell the stale unbrewed coffee grounds in the kitchen down the hall. Teresa from the home care agency was on the line. "Audrey, your grandfather had a stroke. The ambulance is taking him to Memorial." I threw off the covers. As a regional operations director for a hospital supply network, I handled logistics and crisis management for a living, so panic was a luxury I could not afford. At 39, I lived alone in a condo. I bought myself, 4 years after a divorce, that left me with no shared assets and no desire to ever merge my life with someone else's chaos again. I drove to the hospital, and by the time Lindsay arrived an hour late, her mascara was perfectly applied. "Did he say anything before he lost consciousness?" Lindsay asked the attending doctor. She did not ask how he was, and she did not ask if he could recover. Mom grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. "You should have been sleeping at his house, Audrey. If you were there, this would not have happened." I pulled my arm away. He approved the night caregiver schedule, and the agency followed protocol. "I am not having this conversation in a hallway. Grandpa Arthur died that afternoon." The doctors explained the brain damage was irreversible, and the machines keeping him alive were turned off. I stood by the bed, listening to the steady hum of the equipment fade into absolute silence. My throat felt tight, but I kept my own breathing even. Lindsay immediately pulled out her phone. She positioned herself behind me, took a picture of my hand resting on Grandpa's shoulder, and sent it to the extended family group chat with a long caption about our devastating loss. The monitor flatlined, and she was already checking her notifications. She had to be the center of the grief. "You need to handle the funeral arrangements," Mom told me on the walk to the parking lot. "You are always so good at the cold things." "I will coordinate the logistics," I said. "But every invoice goes directly to Nora Sloan as the fiduciary. I am not putting a funeral on my personal credit card." Mom scoffed, wrapping her coat tighter against the March wind. "Your grandfather just died, and you are worried about billing." I did not argue. I just got in my car and sent the email to Nora. 2 weeks later, we sat in Dana Whitlock's law office. The room smelled of expensive leather and brewed espresso. Dana opened the thick manila folder containing the final will, the crisp paper rustling in the heavy quiet. Grandpa had signed it 6 months before his death. Nora was confirmed as the personal representative of the estate. Then Dana read the distribution. I was to receive the residue of the estate. After taxes and probate costs, it came to roughly $3.4 million. Lindsay was to receive a fixed sum of $50,000. Mom would receive nothing additional, as the document noted the house transfer and the extensive financial support Grandpa had provided her over his lifetime. The room went completely silent. I stared at the polished mahogany table. I had never asked for this, and I did not even know the appointment had taken place. My first instinct was entirely procedural. "Did he book the appointment himself?" I asked Dana. "Did he meet with you alone?" Lindsay shot out of her chair. "The old will split everything down the middle. You forced him into this." "Lindsay, please sit down," Dana said. "No," Lindsay snapped, her voice shrill. "She was in his house every week. She made him do this." We walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight of the parking lot, where Lindsay stepped in front of my car door. You are going to sign an agreement right now, Lindsay said. We split it into equal halves, just like he originally wanted. Mom stepped up beside her. Do the right thing, Audrey. Give her half. It is the only way to keep this family together. I looked at the two of them, realizing they truly believed my compliance was the only glue holding us intact. I am not signing anything in a parking lot, I said. Any proposals need to go through your attorney to mine. Do not use his name to pressure me. Lindsay stepped closer. If you do not fix this, I will prove you isolated him. I will tell the court you controlled his medication so he would be confused enough to sign. I froze. Controlled his medication. It was a very specific phrase, especially since no one had ever discussed his prescriptions outside of his medical team. I unlocked my car, got in, and drove away without another word. A month passed. The process server found me at my condo on a Tuesday evening, handing over a heavy envelope. I took the thick stack of papers, locked the door, and carried them to my kitchen island. They hit the marble counter with a solid thud. I placed the complaint down next to my dark blue care binder, and I took a picture of the envelope to document the exact time of service. My corporate training kicked in, turning fear into a checklist. The filing sought to invalidate the final will. The accusations were neatly typed out. Undue influence. Isolation. Medication control. Concealment of visitors. Attached at the back was a sworn declaration signed by my mother. I read the second paragraph twice. It stated that she repeatedly begged to see her father and was refused. My chest felt heavy, but my hands were completely steady. I did not call her. Instead, I opened my phone settings and revoked her access code to my smart lock, hearing the distant click of the deadbolt securing itself. Then I initiated a full backup of my messages to the cloud server. I opened my care binder to the tab for the previous October. I found the specific date Mom claimed I had barred her from the house, and I pulled up my text history. There it was. A message from her on that exact morning. I am not driving that far for 1 hour. I placed the phone beside the binder and called Elliot Crane. He answered on the second ring. I have the complaint, I told him. Take a breath, Audrey, Elliot said. We knew they were angry. They are not just angry, I said, staring at the printed lies and the digital truth resting side by side on my counter. They did not forget what happened. They rewrote it. I stood at the kitchen island in my condo, staring at a hospital supply shortage report on my laptop screen. The apartment smelled lightly of cedar and eucalyptus. It was March 2023, exactly 2 years before my grandfather died. At the time, my biggest crisis was a missing shipment of surgical masks for 3 regional medical centers. My emergency fund sat comfortably at 14 months of living expenses. 4 years had passed since my divorce was finalized, and my 2-bedroom apartment was quiet, orderly, and entirely mine. The peace broke when my phone vibrated against the marble counter. Mom's name flashed on the caller identification. He fell, Mom said the moment I answered. Your grandfather collapsed in the kitchen. The neighbor called the paramedics. I closed the laptop, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. You need to take a leave of absence, Mom continued, her voice rising in pitch. Pause your career for a while. Move into his guest room. I will be at the hospital in 20 minutes, I told her, and I ended the call. The emergency room smelled of bleach and sterile packaging. I walked past the nurse's station and found Arthur sitting up in a hospital bed, looking annoyed rather than frail. A pale blue blanket was draped over his legs. I did not ask Mom what we should do. I pulled a chair up next to his bed, looked him directly in the eye, and asked what he actually wanted. He wanted to go back to his own house, and he absolutely refused to look at the glossy assisted living brochures the hospital social worker had handed him. The next afternoon, I sat at his polished oak dining table with a yellow legal pad. I mapped out a home care agency schedule, a medical alert system, and a transportation rotation for his weekly doctor visits. That morning, I had already negotiated a 3-day remote work hybrid schedule with my corporate office. I blocked out 2 nights a week for my own life, leaving the weekends open for the agency nurses. My sister dropped by just as I finished organizing the agency contracts into a neat stack. Lindsay picked up the printed schedule, her manicured fingernail tracing the blocked hours. "If you really loved him, you would not need to count your hours," my sister said, dropping the paper back onto the table. I kept my tone perfectly level. "A plan is how I make sure love does not become an emergency every day." A week later, Dana Whitlock and Nora Sloan sat on the floral couches in the living room to discuss his changing needs. Nora managed his investments, but Arthur wanted someone in the family to hold financial power of attorney. He looked across the coffee table at me. "I trust you the most, Audrey," he said. I shook my head. "No. I am coordinating the daily care. I do not want to be the person managing the medical schedules and the person signing the checks. It creates a conflict." I agreed to be his emergency medical contact, with strictly limited authority over healthcare decisions only. I drafted an email confirming my refusal of financial control and copied everyone in the family. Lindsay replied privately to mock me for playing the moral superior. Yet, less than an hour later, she called Nora to ask who exactly had authorization to view the monthly bank statements. The dark blue care binder did not start as a defense strategy. It started because of a Tuesday morning cardiologist appointment. 3 weeks prior, I had sent the calendar invitation to the family group text. Mom accepted immediately. The morning of the appointment, my phone buzzed with a text from her. She had scheduled brunch with Lindsay and would not make it. I drove him to the clinic myself. 2 days later, my aunt called me, furious. Mom had told the extended family that I took Grandpa to the heart specialist and deliberately refused to tell anyone he was going. I did not argue in the group chat. I printed the original invitation, Mom's acceptance, and her cancellation text. I punched holes in the paper, placed them in a blue binder, and wrote a single line on the index page. Invitation sent. Accepted. Cancelled by Marilyn. Arthur watched me snap the metal ring shut. "Why are you writing all that down?" "Because the story keeps changing after the day is over," I said. My sister rarely visited unless she needed an audience. One Sunday, she arrived with an expensive bouquet of lilies. She spent 10 minutes taking selfies with Arthur in his armchair. Then the real purpose of the visit began. Lindsay sat on the sofa, put her phone away, and leaned forward. "Grandpa, does this house still have a mortgage?" she asked. He blinked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Before he could answer, she fired another question. "Who is the beneficiary on the brokerage account, and is that old will from 5 years ago still valid?" I walked into the living room and set a glass of water on a coaster. "Any questions about finances need to go to Nora." Lindsay stood up, her face flushing bright red. "You are trying to hide things from your own sister." Arthur sat quietly in his chair, listening to every word, but he did not intervene. After she stormed out, I opened the blue binder and logged the time of her visit and the exact questions she asked. That evening, I was back in my condo, reviewing a risk management lecture for an online certification. The rain tapped against the glass of my living room window. A colleague texted, asking to grab dinner. I typed out a yes. My phone immediately buzzed with a voicemail notification. Mom's voice filled the quiet apartment. She demanded I call Lindsay and apologize for being so hostile about family matters. I did not call back. I finished my chapter, sent my colleague a confirmation for dinner, and typed a single text to Mom. I will discuss his medical care. I will not discuss Lindsay's access to his accounts. I put the phone face down on the desk and went to grab my coat. I did not see the text Lindsay sent to Mom a few minutes later. It was a photograph of a green folder sitting on Arthur's desk, labeled estate planning. "Do you know whether the old will can be replaced without us?" Lindsay had written beneath the image. The dynamic between my mother and my sister required constant funding. We sat in a crowded Italian restaurant celebrating Mom's 65th birthday. The waiter cleared our plates and set a leather checkbook in the center of the table. Lindsay patted her designer handbag, feigning a sudden gasp, and announced she had forgotten her wallet. She had done the exact same thing when I was 16 working a summer job, while her allowance was always protected as an investment in her future. I pulled out my credit card, calculating the total for my meal and Arthur's dinner, and left exactly that amount. Mom stared at the remaining balance. She called my actions cold and entirely unnecessary. "I am your daughter," I told her, keeping my voice quiet enough not to carry to the next table, not the family credit line. That boundary lasted exactly 1 week. Lindsay showed up at my condo with a glossy business plan. She needed $120,000 to secure a commercial lease for her boutique real estate brokerage. Since she had never been married and had no financial partner, she wanted Arthur to provide the loan, but she needed me to co-sign the paperwork to convince him. I read through the printed pages. The cash flow assumptions relied on selling luxury properties in a stagnant market. I placed the folder back in her hands. I refused to sign my name to a fantasy. Lindsay snatched the paper, her voice echoing in my hallway as she accused me of wanting her to fail. The retaliation arrived the next evening. The brass lock on my front door clicked, and my mother let herself in using the physical spare key I had given her years ago. She stood in my kitchen, gesturing to my furniture, and argued that a single woman with no children to feed had a moral obligation to help her own blood. I pulled out my phone, opened the security application, and permanently disabled her smart lock access. I did not ask for the physical key back yet. I simply told her I had paid Lindsay's rent during an emergency 3 years ago, but I refused to finance a lifelong pattern. "Your grandfather will remember who has a heart," Mom warned, turning toward the door. "I do not build my life around being named in a will," I replied. Arthur was not blind to the machinery of our family. By July, 8 months before his death, the relentless requests for cash had forced him to sit down with his accountant. He requested a comprehensive review of his lifetime support ledger. He brought it up while we were sitting on his back porch drinking iced tea. He did not yell or express outrage. He simply listed the reality: tuition payments, a housing down payment, 2 massive credit card rescues, and a failed business loan. Over the years, he had handed Lindsay roughly $620,000. Mom had received a house and debt relief. I had received birthday checks and repaid a short-term car loan in full. Arthur set his glass on the wrought iron table. He asked what I would do if he left me a larger portion of the estate than anyone expected. I looked at the garden, refusing to engage with the hypothetical scenario. I told him my caregiving schedule had nothing to do with his bank accounts. I advised him to meet with his attorney alone if he wanted to make any adjustments. "Why will you not come with me?" Arthur asked, studying my face. "Because if anyone ever questions your choice, I want the answer to be yours," I said. I gathered my keys and walked through the house toward the front door. Before I reached the entryway, I heard Arthur pick up the landline phone in the study. He dialed a number, his voice carrying through the quiet hallway. He asked to speak with Dana Whitlock. I stopped walking, listening to the dry, steady tone of his voice. He requested a private appointment to change his estate distribution. He explicitly stated that he would arrange his own transportation through the home care agency. "I want Audrey nowhere near the signing," Arthur told his lawyer. "If Lindsay challenges it, I want there to be nothing she can put in Audrey's hands." In September, 6 months before his death, a driver from the home care agency picked Arthur up at 10 in the morning. I was standing in a fluorescent-lit conference room 30 miles away, presenting a quarterly supply chain report to the hospital board. My digital calendar and corporate presentation logs captured my exact location. I did not know the black sedan had pulled into the parking lot of Dana Whitlock's law firm. I would piece the timeline together much later through legal invoices and sworn testimony. Dana met with him alone behind closed doors, asked him to detail his assets, and verified his mental capacity with 2 independent witnesses. He signed the final document without a single family member in the building, and the firm locked the original in their heavy steel vault. Nora Sloan received her instructions regarding her executor duties, and I was told absolutely nothing. Life continued without any obvious shifts, but the careful construction of their lawsuit had already begun. The following week, I emailed Mom 3 different time slots for a weekend visit. She selected Saturday afternoon, only to cancel 4 hours beforehand because Lindsay was hosting a luxury property open house. 3 days passed. A distant aunt called me, her voice sharp with judgment, demanding to know why I was keeping a daughter away from her elderly father. My jaw tightened, but I did not waste breath arguing with extended family. I simply forwarded the email thread and the cancellation text to Elliot Crane. He had not been retained for litigation yet, but his advice over the phone was crisp and simple. Save the original messages and do not edit a single word. The trap tightened further a few days later. Teresa and a registered nurse stood in Grandpa's kitchen, conducting a mandatory medication inventory. The house smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and brewing tea. Mom sat at the marble island, squinting at an amber plastic bottle, complaining she had left her reading glasses in the car. She held the bottle out to me. I took the plastic container and read the dosage label aloud. Lindsay walked through the back door at that exact second, lifting her phone. The camera shutter clicked. "Look at Audrey running the whole pharmacy," Lindsay said, offering a bright, artificial smile. I set the bottle back onto the counter, right next to the nurse's clipboard, and looked my sister in the eye. "Do not post his medical information online." Lindsay slipped the phone into the pocket of her tailored coat. "I was just taking a family memory." She agreed not to post it, but she kept the file. The final tipping point occurred during a Sunday brunch at the house. My phone buzzed with an urgent vendor escalation, forcing me to step out onto the front porch. I paced the wooden deck, entirely focused on delayed shipping manifests and supply shortages. Inside the house, Arthur sat quietly in his leather armchair, his eyes closed, giving the perfect impression of sleep. Lindsay and Mom lingered in the adjacent hallway. I did not hear a single word of their conversation. I would not know what was said until the transcripts were produced during the discovery process. Lindsay lowered her voice, explaining to our mother that if Grandpa changed his will, they would use my blue binder and the medication management to prove I completely controlled him. Mom asked if a judge would actually believe that story. Lindsay assured her that a grieving daughter and an excluded granddaughter would always sound more convincing in a courtroom than the woman who walked away with the money. Arthur did not open his eyes. He did not confront them or demand an explanation. When the brunch ended and everyone went their separate ways, he waited exactly 1 hour before picking up his landline telephone. He called Elliot Crane. My grandfather detailed the entire hallway conversation, refusing to let his legacy be twisted into a weapon against me. Elliot advised him against screaming matches or uncontrolled audio recordings. Instead, Arthur decided to invite them back for a formal, open discussion about the estate. He would place a camera directly on the mantel, entirely in plain sight, and announce the recording to the room. The plan was clean and procedural. Give them the opportunity to speak the truth, or force them to own their lies on a digital record. Elliot agreed to arrange a secure courier to transfer the memory card immediately after the meeting concluded. Before hanging up, Elliot asked a final question. He wanted to know if he should inform me about the upcoming meeting. "No," Arthur replied, his voice firm and absolute over the phone line. "If this becomes a fight, she must be able to say she did not build the weapon." I watched the digital file so many times in the months following the trial that I memorized the exact cadence of their breathing. The footage was recorded 3 days before my grandfather died. A small black camera sat directly on the brick mantel in the living room, completely visible to anyone walking through the front door. Arthur sat in his leather recliner, looking straight into the lens. He stated the date, the 4th of March, 2025, and announced that the conversation regarding his estate was being recorded to prevent future confusion. Lindsay shifted on the floral sofa, crossing her arms. She immediately asked if the recording was my idea. The old man shook his head, his voice raspy but perfectly clear. He told them I had no idea the meeting was taking place. Mom nodded her approval, smoothing her skirt. She genuinely believed the camera would capture her playing the role of the devoted, concerned daughter, creating a flawless piece of evidence for herself. Then Arthur laid out the reality. He did not read the exact dollar amounts, but he explained that the residue of the estate would go to me. He reminded them of the massive financial help my sister had received over the decades, and he noted that I had handled his daily care without ever requesting financial authority. That practiced charm dropped from my sister's face. The corners of her mouth tightened into a hard line. She argued that the old will split everything evenly, claiming she should not be punished just because she needed help in the past. Grandpa kept his hands folded in his lap. Fairness did not always mean dividing the same number twice, he told her quietly. Lindsay leaned forward, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. She declared that if he kept that decision, she would contest the will in court. Arthur asked her on what grounds. Without hesitating, my sister looked at our mother. Lindsay stated that Marilyn would testify under oath that I had prevented family members from visiting, isolated him, and heavily controlled his medication. Silence hung in the living room. The grandfather who had bailed them out of every crisis stared at his only daughter. He asked Mom if those accusations were true. Mom refused to meet his eyes. She looked down at the coffee table and muttered that if he just split the money equally, nobody would have to say such painful things. Lindsay offered a cold smile. By the time anyone proved the story false, she reminded him he would already be in the ground. Arthur did not yell, and he did not throw them out immediately. He simply turned his head and looked directly into the camera lens. "Elliot," Arthur said, addressing the lawyer who would eventually receive the file. "If they take Audrey to court, preserve every minute." The meeting ended, and my grandfather ordered them out of his house. Within the hour, he handed the original memory card to a bonded courier sent by the law firm. A digital custodian at Elliot's office created a secure, unalterable copy, logging the exact metadata and preserving the chain of custody. While that transfer secured my future, I sat entirely oblivious in my condo. I spent that exact hour finalizing a presentation on inventory logistics, drinking lukewarm tea, and assuming my family was simply having a quiet Tuesday. 3 days later, the stroke hit. After the hospital room went silent and the machines were turned off, the machinery of grief took over. We buried him on a cold, overcast Thursday. The cemetery grass sank beneath my black heels as I stood near the polished casket. Relatives murmured their condolences, repeatedly praising my sister for the beautiful photos she had posted online during his final months. Lindsay stepped close to my side, the scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the smell of damp earth. She kept her voice low, meant only for my ears. "Whatever he signed, I can undo," Lindsay whispered. I did not flinch, and I did not offer a threat in return. Instead, I memorized the exact timestamp of her words and the names of the cousins standing 3 feet away. Elliot Crane watched us from the edge of the burial plot. He stood, with his hands buried in the pockets of his dark wool coat. He knew the video existed, securely locked in his firm's digital vault, but he had not mentioned a single word of it to me yet. When the crowd began walking back toward the parked cars, Elliot motioned for me to step into the quiet shade of a large oak tree. The wind rustled the dry branches above us. "Your grandfather left a recording," Elliot told me, his tone strictly professional. "Before you ask?" "No. It does not automatically win the case." I looked back toward the road, watching my mother and sister climb into a black sedan. "And the part you need most," Elliot added, his voice softening just a fraction, may be the hardest part to play. The demand arrived in a heavy ivory envelope delivered by a process server at my office. I sat at my desk, the hum of the air conditioning unit filling the room, while I read the formal request from Lindsay's legal team. They wanted $1,700,000, a signed non-disclosure agreement, and an immediate dismissal of the probate contest. In exchange, Lindsay would drop the will challenge and Mom would retract her accusations of elder abuse. My hands did not shake as I scanned the fine print of the settlement offer. Mom called me on my cell phone 5 minutes later. She sobbed, telling me that this was the only way to save our family from the public ruin of a trial. I gripped the phone, staring at the gray skyline visible through my office window. "If the accusations are actually true, Mom," I said, keeping my tone flat and even, "why are you willing to drop them for money?" She stammered for a moment, switching gears to talk about how exhausted she felt. I interrupted her. "A family does not charge $1,700,000 to withdraw a lie," I told her, and I ended the call. The following week, I moved my operations into a legal war room at Elliot Crane's office. I spent 12 hours a day sitting at a conference table that smelled of wax and stale coffee, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with my life. I didn't edit the file names or try to curate the evidence into a perfect story. I simply kept the originals exactly as they were. I created an index with dates, Lindsay's specific legal claims, the corresponding records, and the independent third parties who could verify every single detail. Elliot watched me work, noting that the care binder wasn't an absolute proof of victory in itself. It was, however, the map that allowed us to identify exactly which custodians needed to be subpoenaed. My career in logistics proved useful again. I viewed the documents as a series of complex supply chain nodes. Every node needed validation. I didn't allow myself to panic over the gaps in their logic. I just closed the gaps one by one. Nora Sloan, as the personal representative for the estate, handled the administrative decisions, while Dana Whitlock prepared the witness statements regarding the final will execution. I provided my personal records to the council but refused to dictate how the estate's lawyers handled the witnesses. My restraint was deliberate. If I were the one commanding the entire process, I knew a judge would eventually look at me and see a beneficiary trying to buy a verdict. I stayed inside the lines. Elliot explained the situation regarding the video during our lunch break. The court had received the evidence during discovery, but my sister's attorneys had filed an aggressive motion to block the final section of the recording. They claimed it was unfairly prejudicial, merely a family argument, and entirely irrelevant if the court already had the medical records. The judge hasn't made a final ruling on the admissibility of that last segment, Elliot said, tapping his pen against his legal pad. It will be much more effective if she denies the threats under oath first. If she lies on the stand, we can use the video to impeach her testimony. I didn't ask Elliot to brainstorm ways to trap my sister. I simply told him we would follow the court's rules and not leak a single frame to the press. That evening, the brass key clicked in the lock of my condo before I could reach the door. Mom stepped into the living room, clutching her purse. She had used the physical spare key I had given her years earlier, the same key she had never returned after I disabled her smart access. She started to cry, telling me that Lindsay was just scared of being abandoned and that Grandpa had given me too much power. I stood by the door, refusing to offer her a seat. I told her that all future communication regarding the estate needed to go through our attorneys. "You always saved us," Mom said, her voice dripping with desperation. "Why are you being so cruel now?" "That is exactly why you thought I would pay," I said, and I didn't offer a hug or a glass of water. I simply opened the door, waiting for her to walk out. I didn't take the key from her hand just yet. I saved that for later. The final realization occurred when the discovery responses arrived. Lindsay had signed a verified document stating she had never discussed a will contest with anyone while Arthur was alive. She claimed I had isolated him and controlled his medications. I opened the care binder, pulled up the calendar logs, and cross-referenced her answers with the text messages. She hadn't just misinterpreted history. She had committed to a specific, provable falsehood in a sworn document. I stared at her signature on the last page. She had created the mechanism for her own downfall. If she repeated those denials in front of the judge, the authenticated recording could be used to dismantle her credibility in real time. I looked over at Elliot, who was sorting through a stack of bank statements. I pointed to her verified discovery answers and felt a strange, cold clarity. "Do not warn her what the record says," I told him, closing the binder. "Give her every document the rules require. Then let her choose whether to tell the truth." Lindsay walked into the deposition room with the practiced grace of a luxury real estate agent preparing to close a high-stakes deal. She wore a tailored beige suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, expensive knot that caught the artificial office light. I sat on the opposite side of the mahogany table, my own legal counsel flanking me. Lindsay didn't look my way. Instead, she offered a polite, distant nod to the stenographer and took her seat as if she were the one in control of the morning. "I visited my grandfather at least once every week," Lindsay said, her voice steady and bright. She leaned forward, resting her chin on interlaced fingers. "But every time I tried to arrange a time, Audrey would change the schedule or claim he was too tired to see me." My lawyer pushed a copy of the calendar messages across the table. Lindsay glanced at the paper but didn't bother reading the text. She shrugged, an elegant, dismissive movement of her shoulders. "I suppose I often felt unwelcome," she amended, adjusting the narrative to avoid a direct lie she could be pinned on immediately. It was just an atmosphere she created. I tried my best, but she was always the gatekeeper. She denied asking about bank accounts. She denied knowing anything about the updated will. When asked if she had ever discussed a formal legal challenge while our grandfather was still alive, she shook her head firmly. "Never," Lindsay said, her eyes wide and entirely sincere. "I didn't even know he had changed his estate plan until after he died. Audrey kept that a secret until the very end." I wrote each of her answers down on a notepad, my handwriting deliberate and slow. Every denial was a recorded fact now, locked into the transcript. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst from the attorneys. Just the rhythmic clicking of the stenographer's machine, documenting a version of reality that was becoming more fragile by the second. Mom followed Lindsay later that afternoon, adopting the role of the frail, grieving daughter who had been pushed to the periphery of her own father's life. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, telling the attorney that I had never permitted her a single moment alone with him. And yet, my lawyer said, sliding a thick folder toward her, the visitor logs from the home care agency show you were present in the house on 27 separate occasions when Audrey was physically absent. Mom stared at the pages, her lips thinning. Those logs don't capture the atmosphere of the house. They don't reflect the coldness I felt every time I tried to reach him. Did you ever decline a visit when offered? The attorney asked. Only once or twice. Due to scheduling conflicts, Mom said, clutching the handkerchief. But Audrey made it seem like I was neglecting him. The transcript remained cold and objective, preserving her words for the judge. I watched the session with a detached, analytical interest, noticing the exact moment she chose to pivot from a clear fact to a vague feeling of coldness. It was a strategy built to fail, but she lacked the distance to see it. Teresa from the home care agency arrived the following morning with the requested records. She handed over the logs, the medication inventory sheets, and the caregiver schedules. Nora Sloan followed, presenting the fiduciary reports that verified I had never possessed signatory authority over a single cent of Grandpa's accounts. Every bank statement matched the fiduciary report. There was no missing money, no transfers to my private condo, and no evidence of predatory control. I checked the nodes on my evidence map, crossing out the isolation claim, the financial control claim, and the medication management allegation. The map was turning into a series of cleared obstacles, yet I remained still, waiting for the final piece to fall. My phone chimed in the lobby of the law firm. It was a digital production packet containing years of text history recovered from Mom's cloud account. I sat on a bench and began to read through the messages between Lindsay and Mom. We only need you to say Audrey stopped you from seeing him, Lindsay had texted to Mom 2 weeks after the funeral. She has records, Mom had responded. Records do not matter if you sound like a grieving daughter, Lindsay had replied, followed by a laughing emoji. There was a message from the week after the funeral, warning Mom not to mention the Tuesday visits that contradicted their story. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the lobby window. The betrayal wasn't a sharp, sudden blow anymore. It had become a persistent, dull ache. Mom hadn't been tricked into this path. She had consciously chosen to participate because she preferred a fantasy where she was the victim. The pressure from their side didn't stop at the courtroom doors. An anonymous complaint reached my employer, alleging that I had utilized my logistics credentials to manipulate an elderly man's household. My manager, a man who had known me for 7 years, called me into his office. I didn't hide the probate suit. I handed him the business card of my counsel and a brief statement confirming the pending litigation and the lack of validity in the allegations. He examined the paperwork, asked about my current project load, and let the matter rest. I kept my head down, meeting my deadlines, refusing to let them poison my career. Meanwhile, Lindsay began posting vague, thinly veiled rants online about caregivers who weaponized their positions to become beneficiaries, careful not to name me directly, but clearly poisoning the well of my reputation among our acquaintances. Then came the medication box photo. Lindsay's legal team filed the image as a key piece of evidence, presenting the cropped version to the court. They argued it proved I was forcing Arthur to take medications against his will. Mom signed a supplemental declaration, claiming I had unilaterally decided his dosages while ignoring his protests. The photograph showed me standing next to him, holding the amber bottle while I read the label. I remembered that morning. Teresa and a nurse had been standing right there, conducting a formal inventory. Mom had forgotten her reading glasses, so she had asked me to read the instructions for her. The crop had surgically removed the nurse, the agency clipboard, and the witnesses from the frame. I looked at the image, my pulse quickening. If the agency hadn't kept the original file, this single distorted image could create enough doubt to derail my entire defense. They're painting me as a predator, I told Elliot. my voice finally showing a trace of frustration. If that file is gone, they win the narrative. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stared at the distorted image, his expression grim. We have to find the source. If they have a file, the metadata might still exist. We need the full resolution. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the home care agency, trying to track down the nurse who had been on shift that day. The agency had recently updated their archival systems, and the initial search returned nothing. I walked out of the office into the humid evening, the city lights beginning to blur in the distance. The threat felt closer now, a tightening coil. If Lindsay's team could convince a judge that I had manipulated his medical care, the validity of the entire will would crumble under the weight of an elder abuse finding. I was at my desk when Teresa finally called back, her voice breathless. The primary system had cleared the image, but the nurse had uploaded a full resolution copy to the quality review archive after Lindsay had taken the unauthorized photo. It was a privacy incident, and they had kept the complete file to document the breach. My hands stopped midair. I pulled up the archive, downloaded the original, and clicked open the file. The nurse, the clipboard, and Mom's clearly visible face were all there in high definition. Metadata pinned the time and date directly to a standard medication inventory appointment. I set the laptop down and closed my eyes for a long moment, the tension in my shoulders finally unraveling. The lie wasn't just debunked. It had been recorded and filed in a way that made the falsification of the evidence clear to any impartial observer. Lindsay had walked right into the archive. She had left a digital signature on her own weapon, and now it was about to backfire. The full resolution photograph appeared on my laptop screen like a jagged piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. There were Teresa, the nurse, and Mom all standing in the kitchen, completely unconcerned, while Arthur sat at the table. The metadata attached to the file pinned the image directly to a routine medication inventory appointment. It wasn't the scene of a crime or a secret administration of drugs. It was just a Tuesday. The original document from the nurse's records matched the schedule perfectly, confirming that every dosage was authorized by the physician and managed through the standard nurse line. I didn't need to shout about my innocence. I didn't need to label my mother a liar in front of the judge. The documents were cold, precise, and entirely devastating to their narrative. I handed the full image and the inventory notes to Elliot Crane the next morning. He reviewed the metadata, his expression softening for the first time in months. He updated our evidence map, crossing out the medication control allegation with a thick black pen. 2 independent sources had now demolished the core of their abuse claim. We have them on the facts, Elliot said, tapping the folder. Now we have to keep them there. The week leading up to the trial felt like standing on a cliff edge while the tide slowly rose. We gathered Dana Whitlock, the driver who had taken Arthur to the office, and the 2 witnesses who had been present for the signing of the final will. Dana spent hours rehearsing her testimony, focusing on the clarity of the capacity note she had taken that day. One of the witnesses, a retired accountant who had been a longtime friend of my grandfather, recalled the exact phrasing Arthur used during the signing. He said Audrey would be angry that he didn't tell her, the witness explained during our final preparation session. He said that was exactly how he knew the choice was his. The phrase didn't sound poetic, and it didn't sound like a speech from a movie. It sounded exactly like the stubborn, dry man who had raised me. We gathered for a final pretrial hearing in a small room off the main probate court. The air felt thin, recycled, and entirely devoid of life. Lindsay and Mom sat on the other side of the table, whispering to their counsel. The judge listened to the arguments regarding the video recording. He decided he would allow the portions where Arthur confirmed he understood his estate and explicitly stated that I had not pressured him. However, he placed a temporary restriction on the final, heated segment where my sister and mother threatened to contest the will. He ruled that it remained inadmissible unless the testimony given during the trial made it necessary for the purpose of impeachment. Lindsay's attorneys looked relieved, nodding at their client. They believed they had successfully removed the most damaging evidence from the record. They were convinced that if they could keep the judge from hearing the threats, their version of the grieving family would prevail. I sat quietly, watching the light catch on my sister's diamond earrings. They were confident, and their confidence was exactly what I needed. Back at the law firm, the cracks in their coalition began to show. The mounting attorney fees were draining the reserves they had been so desperate to secure. Lindsay demanded that Mom refinance her own home to keep the litigation moving forward. Mom pushed back, reminding my sister that the entire legal strategy had been Lindsay's idea from the start. Lindsay retaliated by pointing out that Mom had signed the sworn declaration and was now just as liable for the legal costs. They started blaming each other for the lack of progress. I heard reports of these arguments through counsel, but I refused to interject. I wouldn't provide the bridge they needed to rebuild their alliance. The evening before the trial, Lindsay's lead attorney urged her to decline taking the stand. He knew the documentary record was strong and that the risk of her testifying was high. Lindsay ignored him. She was convinced that her charm, her tears, and her practiced ability to tell a compelling story to potential real estate clients would be enough to persuade a judge. She wanted the spotlight. She wanted to be the victim who had finally found the courage to speak up against her greedy sister. Elliot turned to me in the office, his eyes tired. "She's going to get on that stand, Audrey. She's going to stick to the script they wrote together. Do you want to watch the video again before tomorrow morning?" I stood up, gathering my coat. The idea of listening to that final segment alone in a dark office felt like an intrusion into a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. "If that video gets played," I said, my voice steady, "I want to hear it for the first time in the same room where they decided to lie." That night, I didn't practice my own testimony. I didn't drink wine or obsess over the details of my cross-examination. I simply went home and slept. I had done the work. The records were sorted, the facts were verified, and the trap was set. The morning of the trial, the air outside the courthouse was crisp and sharp. I walked through the security metal detectors, my mind clear. Inside the courtroom, the wooden panels seemed to loom over us. Clerk called the name Lindsay Hale. My sister rose from her chair, adjusted her blazer, and walked toward the witness box with the same composed walk she used for her luxury property tours. She placed her hand on the Bible, took the oath, and stepped up to the stand. She scanned the gallery, her gaze finally locking onto mine for the first time in months. Her eyes were hard, focused, and utterly devoid of doubt. "I was the granddaughter he shut out," she said to the judge, her voice trembling just enough to be effective. I looked at her, at the woman who had spent decades playing the victim while taking everything she could, and I felt nothing but a distant, cold curiosity. The stage was set, the lie was spoken, and the path to the end had never been clearer. My sister had successfully cleared the final hurdle to her own destruction. All she had to do now was finish her story, and I would be waiting to see if she could live with the ending. The judge shifted in his chair, leaning forward to catch every word of her crafted, rehearsed grief, completely unaware that he was about to witness the moment the entire illusion would collapse. I tucked my hands into my pockets, feeling the solid, familiar weight of the binder against my side, and waited for the first question to be asked. Everything I had worked for was about to be decided in the space of a single heartbeat. By the time Lindsay reached the center of her testimony, she had rebuilt the same accusation she had repeated for 10 months. According to her, I had isolated Grandpa, controlled his medication, and taken an inheritance that should have been divided equally. Mom watched from the gallery with the same faint, practiced smile she had worn when the trial began. I kept my hands flat against the dark blue binder, feeling the texture of the grain. My sister spent the next hour detailing a version of the past where I had been a cold, calculated gatekeeper. She claimed she had spent months trying to visit, only to be turned away by my excuses. My attorney, Elliot, waited patiently, his pen tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the wooden table. When the cross-examination began, he didn't need to yell. He simply displayed the visitor logs and the original digital invitations. "Lindsay, you testified that you tried to visit at least once every week," Elliot said, pointing to the documents. "Yet these logs show that on 27 separate occasions, you either canceled at the last minute or simply never arrived." "I was doing the best I could," Lindsay insisted, her confidence wavering for the first time. "I had a career to manage." Elliot brought up the lifetime support ledger. He walked her through the $620,000 she had already received from Grandpa while he was alive. She shifted in her seat, her gaze darting toward the gallery. She dismissed the money as nothing more than a father's love, but the judge remained impassive, taking notes in a leather-bound book. Then came the moment that would define the entire proceeding. Elliot asked her clearly if she had ever discussed a formal will contest with Mom while our grandfather was still alive. Never, Lindsay said, her voice sharp and ringing with false conviction. I did not know he had changed the will until after he died. Audrey kept that a secret. She had walked directly into the trap she had helped build. Elliot turned toward the bench, his expression grave. Your Honor, the witness's testimony directly contradicts an authenticated recording already produced in discovery. I move to admit the final segment for the limited purpose of impeaching her testimony. The courtroom went still. The judge reviewed the foundation and the relevance of the request. He nodded, granting the motion. Elliot looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He knew exactly what that final recording contained: the threat, the mention of Mom's perjury, and the cold calculation of a family waiting for an old man to die. I looked at Mom in the gallery. She was still smiling, convinced that whatever was on the tape would show her as a saint. I gave one small nod. The judge nodded toward Elliot. He turned the laptop toward the witness stand, placed one finger on the trackpad, and pressed play. Grandpa's voice filled the room, sounding exactly as he had that Tuesday. He confirmed they all knew they were being recorded. Then, the audio captured Lindsay's voice, sharp and greedy, demanding the will be changed. She detailed how Mom would testify that I had isolated him. She laid out the entire plot to frame me for abuse, to force a settlement. And then, there was the silence. The moment Mom was asked if the story was true and she chose to say nothing, the courtroom felt suffocating. Lindsay's face went pale, her mouth slightly parted as she stared at the screen. Mom stopped smiling, her fingers digging into the fabric of her coat. My sister started to speak, trying to call it an out-of-context argument, but Elliot simply held up the text messages that matched the recording word for word. By the end of the afternoon, the judge announced his ruling from the bench. Arthur had possessed testamentary capacity, the final will had been executed independently, and Lindsay had failed to prove undue influence. He directed the estate's counsel to prepare the written judgment and reserve the questions of attorney fees and sanctions for a separate hearing. As we walked out of the building, the sun felt blindingly bright. Elliot caught my arm for a second, his face grim. He explained that while the will was safe, the legal battle over fees and the public record of the trial had only just begun. I could hear my sister and mother arguing behind me, their voices rising in the parking lot. Lindsay turned. Her eyes narrowed with a frantic, desperate anger. You were supposed to keep your story straight, she hissed at Mom, and for the first time, I realized they were already beginning to devour each other. The written judgment confirming the validity of the final will arrived 6 weeks after the trial ended. It felt like a thin, clinical piece of paper to resolve years of calculated deception, yet its weight was absolute. The estate filed formal motions for attorney fees and sanctions regarding the litigation misconduct Lindsay had committed during discovery. By mid-April 2026, a separate hearing finalized the order. Lindsay was held personally liable for a substantial portion of the legal costs. The $50,000 Arthur had left her in the final will evaporated instantly, consumed by the debt of her own chosen war. She did not receive a single cent of the inheritance she had fought so desperately to claim. My sister's legal counsel filed a motion to withdraw shortly after the sanctions were handed down. During their final interaction in the chambers of the judge, I watched the attorney place his folder on the table. He didn't offer a polite farewell or a handshake. He looked at Lindsay and told her that she hadn't lost because I possessed more money, but because she had lied to everyone in that room, including him. The brokerage firm she worked for suspended her from all client-facing duties while they conducted an internal review of the trial transcripts. By late May, the relationship between Lindsay and the firm had permanently ended, driven by reputational risk and the undeniable reality of her dishonesty. A professional licensing review was opened shortly thereafter. I didn't cheer, and I didn't broadcast the updates to our extended family. I simply watched the silence grow. The bond between my sister and my mother shattered with the suddenness of a dropped vase. I was at the house on a Saturday in June, packing the last of my grandfather's personal effects, when I found them standing near the detached garage. Lindsay was screaming, demanding that Mom pay a share of the sanctions because the sworn declaration Mom signed had been the very anchor that sank their case. Mom shrieked back. calling Lindsay a manipulative architect who had coerced her into every single falsehood. I stood on the porch, listening to the two women who had spent years blaming me for their problems finally turn their full, vicious attention toward each other. I didn't step in to mediate. I didn't try to remind them that they were still family. For the first time, I allowed them to exist in the world they had built for themselves without my interference to smooth the edges. Mom reached out to me 2 weeks later, her voice thin and ragged over the phone. She claimed she was facing eviction from the home Arthur had originally transferred to her, as the mounting litigation fees and a lack of support had pushed her into a financial crisis. She asked if I would consider a temporary loan to help her find a smaller apartment. I sat at my kitchen counter, looking out at the city skyline. I had been paying for her insurance premiums, structural house repairs, and various monthly utilities for over a decade. I told her I would provide a list of community resources for housing assistance and give her until the end of July to transition, but I would not fund her lifestyle or sustain the lies that had cost us everything. She accused me of being a cold, vengeful woman who enjoyed watching her suffer. I remained silent, because the truth was far simpler. I wasn't being vengeful. I was simply finished with the bill. Lindsay approached me one last time in the parking lot of the estate property. She looked disheveled, her expensive suit replaced by a worn sweater. She told me I had taken everything from her. "Grandpa gave me an inheritance," I said, my voice steady against the wind. "You gave up everything else when you turned my care for him into evidence against me." Mom approached us, trying to interject with a plea to fix this privately, away from the eyes of the world. I took the physical spare key from my pocket, the one I had held onto since the day I disabled her smart lock access, and placed it into her hand. "There is nothing left to fix," I told them. I walked to my car, leaving them standing on the pavement. Behind me, the sound of their arguing resumed immediately, a bitter, frantic chorus of accusations regarding who had caused the ruin. It is now July 18, 2026. My life has shifted in ways that still feel quiet and strange. I am still living in my condo, as I never felt the need to move into a mansion just because I could afford the mortgage. I accepted the promotion I had delayed while managing the trial, and I used a portion of the inheritance to seed a small foundation that supports respite care for families struggling to manage their own elder care logistics. I keep the work transparent, managed by a community partner, ensuring the funds are used for relief rather than exploitation. Sometimes, I go back to the original digital file Arthur left for me. I watch the segment where he smiles, just for a moment, and tells the camera he always knew I didn't need his money to be the person who stayed by his side. It isn't a secret. It isn't a hidden key to a greater fortune. It is just the validation of a truth I had spent years demonstrating through every action, every log, and every boundary. For years, I thought strength meant keeping everyone together, sacrificing my own peace to maintain a fragile, artificial harmony. Arthur's last gift was teaching me that sometimes, strength is simply knowing who no longer gets a key. I walk to the door, secure the lock, and for the first time in my life, the house is truly mine. True strength is never found in how much you are willing to endure for the sake of appearances, but in the clarity of knowing when to set a boundary. You may have spent years believing that keeping the peace means absorbing the toxicity of those who claim to love you, but you must remember that loyalty without integrity is just a form of self-betrayal. When you consistently rescue others from the natural consequences of their choices, you are not being a supportive family member. You are actively funding the very patterns that keep you small. Realize that your worth was never tied to your ability to fix broken people, and that walking away from a lie is not an act of cruelty, but an act of liberation. You have the right to curate the people who hold a key to your life, and you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. Have you ever stayed in a situation out of guilt, only to realize that leaving was the only way to find your own voice again?